So, we're engaged in the study of how modernity in the modern world occurred, and we reached our present position. It seems to me that it's rather like the pursuit of the Holy Grail. We keep catching sight of this, and then it flits away and gets further and further away, and in our pursuit, therefore, we have to travel through more and more unknown territory. And what I think a good strategy, therefore, is to cast our net more widely and to pull back our perspective and go back further in time and further in space. So let's go back to 500 years before the rocket in 1830, in other words, in 1350. Now, if you had been in the world in 1350, you would have found England and Britain a small island off the continent of Europe, and Europe itself possibly not the most dominant power in the world. Where would each of us have put our money on where, if there was going to be such a thing as a transformation from agrarian civilization to industrial civilization, where it would occur? What would be our guesses? I think I'll start with Christopher, since many of us would have thought that his area of expertise might have generated such a thing. Christopher.
China in 1350 is a place I think that's hard to evaluate because it hasn't had a very good time for the previous century. It's been under the Yuan dynasty, has therefore been part of the Mongol world empire. And coming to the end of that, it's in a period of some social disorder, possibly with quite a lot of population drop because of disease. Records are not very good, so we're not in a marvellous position to evaluate the circumstances. But if, on the other hand, you look at what they've got behind them in 1350, which is, I think, the perspective we should take, they've got an immense record of material progress and of technical fertility, ranging all the way from the arts of metalworking to the improvement of agriculture, that I think put them in a very strong position, certainly for future progress, once they've got over the troubles of those years.
So China would be your bet?
I think I'd be very interested in China as a place to put my money on in 1350, although, as I said, with some reservations that it's going through a bumpy patch for a while.
Simon, where would you have put your money on?
Yes, I mean, I think China has got to be the bookies' favourite. I'm a little disturbed already by the idea of some kind of race here. You know, I think the tacit analogy that we're using of some kind of horse race, I mean, which, quote, country has the most chance of industrializing or making the transition from traditional agrarian regimes to something like proto or modern industrial regimes. I mean, that doesn't seem to me to be quite the right question. The question to ask, if one's looking at a sort of 500-year span, is to look at particular links, particular processes and connections which have been forged. And that means that we ought to be focusing for the early centuries of that half a millennium on where there are dynamic and perhaps even conflicted relationships being set up within the perspective of the world economy. Yes. Now, what's interesting, I speak from complete ignorance, I should have thought, about the Chinese case, is that almost all the connections, trading connections, exchange of goods, communication between different practical traditions, communication between different political and religious regimes, are, as it were, within a particular cultural sphere. And not only are they within that sphere, but the culture represents those connections as being virtuous because they're internal, because they're part of the Middle Kingdom. And one might want to start asking, well, what was the effect of the Mongol conquest of China, which in an absolutely unparalleled way sets up at least formal and perhaps real links between the world of Kublai Khan and the far west, the western edge of the known world, right? Beyond the Urals, beyond the Black Sea, to these barbarous lands far away from the centre of the known world.
Couldn't agree with this more. I mean, I answered the question to which country because that was the challenge put. But I would far prefer to ask about the state of the world, which for us in this period still means mainly the old world, doesn't it? And ask what is happening there and what the interesting connections are that are going on between cultures. And of course, as Simon rightly says, although at the end of the Yuan dynasty, because the Mongol world empire was breaking up, we can see certain rather unpleasant features historically for China and for the bits of the world been involved in. Certainly, it's incredibly significant that there was a time when China was part of a world in which there was safe communication all the way from the extreme east end of the Eurasian continent all the way into northwestern Europe, and ambassadors and missionaries and traders, so long as they paid for their visa effectively from the Mongols, could travel safely all the way. And if there was any trouble from bandits, they simply informed the next Mongol cavalry post, would say, "I'm terribly sorry you've been in trouble, sir." Go and deal with them, because the Mongols had made the decision that the best way to run the world was, of course, simply to tax it and to provide, well, protection services for those engaged in making money.
Something the modern state has discovered also.
Absolutely. And
So it's a sort of globalized Chicago.
well, yes, there you are, exactly. And during that period, that's the period during which we can trace whole packages of techniques becoming world property rather than just being in one particular place, as gunpowder weapons, most importantly, for instance. And certainly there are other things that travel from east to west during this period. This is certainly the period when we find that metalworking techniques begin to be known in the undeveloped northwestern part of Eurasia that had been known for 1,000 years or so. In East Asia and so on, compass, stern post, rudder, all the rest of it and so on, many other things too. So I do like the idea of a world perspective, and I frankly think this is the way we ought to be talking about when the Industrial Revolution occurs and where it occurs. We ought to be looking about what it is about the way the whole world works if we are looking for explanations of why something happens in a particular place at a particular time. The idea that there could possibly have been anything like an industrial revolution in 18th, 19th century Britain without us taking account of the existence of the whole of the rest of the world and what had been going on for the previous 1,000 years is, I think, misleading. So, certainly.
I obviously agree with you. But Joel, you're coming in on...
Well, at the risk of sounding a bit contrary, I should like to make a very little plea for an area which I think, certainly if we're looking at the period between 1250 and 1350, would have been a reasonable bet to become the cradle of economic progress, and that's the Middle East and the Islamic world. We do know, of course, that in the ages that we call the Dark Ages, a bad term to be sure for Europe, the civilized part of Europe were the areas around the Mediterranean, Islamic area, people who spoke languages such as Arabic, Farsi, languages like that. They were more literate, they were far more sophisticated chemists, agriculturalists, doctors, mathematicians. Many of the things that we often believe led in one way or another to industrial progress. One of the really difficult questions, I think, that has never been solved to my satisfaction is what exactly goes wrong with the Middle East that sort of, in some sense, eliminates it as a contender by the modern age. And at least one argument that can be made is that they just had bad luck, that they were not able to stave off the invaders from Central Asia the way the Europeans did. That what Timur-Lenk does to Islamic civilization in Persia and in Mesopotamia, which is today Iraq, is so devastating that his impact can be compared to the asteroid that destroyed the dinosaurs and that gave us mammals a chance, basically by good luck, to move into the vacuum that had been created by this disaster. And I think the destruction of that part of the Middle East and then the filling of the void, so to speak, by the Ottoman Turks really has implications that should not be underestimated. There also is, I mean, I must say, Islamic civilization is fairly widespread, and there's different parts of it. You know, there is this sort of eastern part in Mesopotamia and Persia, and then there is the part in the West. And of course, in the West, the disaster is called the Reconquista, right? In which Christians gradually push back and ultimately eliminate Islamic civilization in the Iberian Peninsula. That is, certainly from their point of view, an equally bad disaster, although we don't tend to think of it in those terms. But I think if you go to an early point in the Middle Ages, there is no way you could have predicted this. And I think Islamic civilization did not have to turn out the way it did. There are many elements in it that the Europeans took over, lock, stock, and barrel. We even
Eagerly and deliberately.
And sort of, and they were proud of it. We still use the term, also it is a misnomer, Arabic numerals, and we don't feel coy about it to say, well, this, we give them, so to speak, credit.
And algebra.
Oh, lots of words, you know, algebra and alcohol, and all of these words that start with AL are either derived from Arabic or believed to have been. And you know, and many of the things that eventually played such a big role in the Industrial Revolution, including cotton, to mention one, came to Europe from the Mediterranean world, which of course at that time was dominated by Islam. And so I should like to think that at least they had the potentiality, ex ante, of doing what Europe eventually did. And explaining why Europe became what it eventually became requires us to explain what went wrong, quote unquote.
Do you think there's anything to be said for the opposite argument? That, look, what we're interested in here is not spotting the successful cultures, spotting the successful civilizations from a global perspective, but trying to pinpoint processes which are going to drive apparently successful agrarian, feudal, administrative systems in this surprisingly new direction. If that's the question, then presumably we shouldn't perhaps be looking at cultures which are wildly successful and self-confident, but at cultures which are in deep crisis and engineer their way out. For example, right at the start of our period, middle to late 14th century, Western Europe experiences an absolutely catastrophic plague, the Black Death, which kills a very large proportion of the active population, and therefore, to be callous about it, makes labour expensive. And under those circumstances, if you have a population crash, what is called a Malthusian crisis, in which there's some great natural disaster which completely devastates a population, is it right to say, well, look, there are circumstances in which you might well start to see a displacement of social and economic activity from time-consuming but basically efficient agricultural systems towards systems which are going to accelerate productivity by machinery, which are going to try to survive not by pastoral and arable systems alone. And therefore, I mean, although, as one says, one's money might be on China or on the Islam of the Fertile Crescent and Persia, those systems actually were doing reasonably well. So don't put your money there. Put it somewhere which is in trouble and which might be driven towards the start of a more technical, more industrially based culture.
Yes, I think that, well, we've heard that the other places were in trouble too, so it's what kind of trouble and in what context. But perhaps we can now focus down because we clearly have a huge puzzle. You would have certainly not expected in 1350 that Western Europe would develop into the first industrial civilization. So in order to refine this a little bit, let's just look at a couple of technologies. These are fairly randomly chosen, but they seem to be quite important, in which you can see a growing differentiation. If we pursue the metaphor that technology is that objects are embedded knowledge, by examining the objects, we can see how a sort of divergence begins to occur. What caused it is another matter. There are social, political, and so on forces, but at least we can watch it happening. And in speculating about why it happened, we may reveal some of the causes. Now, it's a well-known theory among historians that one of the things that distinguishes the West from any other civilization from very early on is an obsession with time. Most of us know this in our present lives. We are ruled by time, tick-tock, tick-tock. Everything around us is timed, and time integrates our civilization. Now, we might believe that this is a universal human characteristic, but if you go on holiday to many parts of the world still, you get into a slower time scale. So we've experienced this. And many historians think that maybe one of the reasons why the West developed differently from other civilizations is this obsession with time, and particularly with mechanical time, not the organic, natural rhythm created by the sun and the moon and the stars and wind and water, but precise time generated, created by a machine. Some people say that the first machine of the Industrial Revolution was the clock. It didn't produce ordinary goods. It produced seconds and minutes, which were identical products. So when does this occur, and is this true that it's a differentiation? Well, homing in on this, and particularly on the mechanical clock, Joel, you've been to think about these sort of things.
Well, people always wanted, I think, to have some kind of notion of what time it was in the day. And we know that in classical civilization, they used sundials, they used water clocks. Their Hellenistic civilization actually was quite clever in building clocks that were run on water. But the problem is that water clocks aren't very satisfactory. In Europe, for instance, in the winter, they freeze over, so when it gets real cold, you don't know what time it is. That sort of thing can be annoying. And at some point, we don't know exactly when, but it was late 13th century, somebody in Europe, we do not know who, makes a really big breakthrough here. And it's a successful way of measuring time through mechanical means. And this depends on a mechanism which is known as an escapement mechanism, which essentially creates an oscillator, like a pendulum. Also, the pendulum itself wasn't added to the clock until centuries later, but something that goes back and forth, back and forth. And this takes actually a huge intellectual leap, something that's easy to underappreciate, because what we think of time, at least instinctively, is something that is continuous, that can be divided into ever smaller and smaller units, and that moves unidirectionally, right? It moves from the past to the future. But the mechanical clocks actually did not measure time like that. They were a way in which you could convert bidirectional, discontinuous motion into something that is unidirectional and continuous. And in some sense, our quartz clocks still do that, because they tick discontinuously, and yet they convert that motion into something that is continuous. Now, this is a hard thing to do, and people probably must have been experimenting with this for a long time. But what is amazing is that when the problem is solved, it spreads like wildfire. Within a few decades, every town in Europe that respected itself had a clock tower that gave the clock to anybody who wanted to look. And this is, I think, something which sets Europe a little bit apart from other societies that try to measure time. It's not just that they were interested in it, but that it was democratic. that it wasn't the emperor's time or the king's time or the duke's time. This was the time that everybody could look at and know what time it is. And needless to say, this from an economic point of view, this is a huge step forward, because a lot of economic activity and social activity as well requires coordination. If you and I decide to have lunch tomorrow, and we have lunch at 12:30, it's sort of presumed that 12:30 for you is 12:30 for me, so we actually touch base. But if we make an appointment in the middle of the day, and you say, when the sun is at the top of the sky or something like that, well, you know, you may miss by half an hour or something like that, and that makes coordination more difficult to do. And so in terms of just the coordination of economic activity, having this democratization is very, very important. One could also argue that, of course, it allows you to measure productivity. Because productivity makes only sense if we divide it by some unit of time. Okay, so now you could argue that, of course, the day is a fairly natural unit, but the length of the day varies quite a bit in Europe, and you might want a more precise measure. And so just for somebody who worked or had other people working for him to see how much a worker could produce in an exact unit of time and compare it to what other workers were doing, gives you a managerial tool that's obviously indispensable. One other consequence of the clock, a somewhat different dimension, is worth mentioning, and that is, in order to make a clock, you need workmanship of a level that previously was not required for almost anything. You need really to build mechanisms that are accurate to a very high degree of precision. And it is not surprising that the people who became clockmakers, who made them and repaired them in Europe, ultimately ended up inventing many other instruments, many other machines, simply because they were people who had a skill that was unequaled by anybody else in those societies. And so the invention of the clock plays a very complicated role, but all of them point in one direction, which is economic and technological rationalization, which is a big step. It's certainly not the last step, but it is a first big step that the Europeans make at that time.
Excellent. Any comments on that?
Well, I would like to say something about the situation at the other end of the world in China. What's surprising is how many things in the story of the clock are in fact already there in China, although China is not the land in which every city ended up with a mechanical clock of its own. And I think it helps us to be puzzled, and we want to be puzzled, don't we, at this stage in the riddle, I think. If we look at that carefully, it's certainly the case that Chinese culture is very interested in time indeed. One of the central functions of the imperial state from the beginning of the Chinese Empire in the 3rd century BC is to provide an accurate calendar, but by a calendar meaning not just the days of the equivalent of the week and the month and things like that, but an increasingly detailed scheme that tells you what the cosmos will be doing at any instant, what stars will be culminating at any given hour and so on, exactly what the moon and the sun will be up to and so on and so forth. And this was not just for the purposes of contemplation and the seeking after knowledge, but because the Chinese scheme of how you ought to plan your life very much lays stress on doing things at the right time. If you don't do a ritual at the right time, if you don't conduct medical treatment at the right time, if you get married at the wrong time, things will go badly awry. So knowing exactly what moment things should be done at is very important in China. And from the beginning of the Christian era, there's a long history of people at court making increasingly complicated devices for giving you a model of the cosmos that you can look at, that is changing as the cosmos changes. It starts off with people making, say, an armillary sphere, which is essentially just a model of the great circles of of astronomical coordinates, the celestial equator and so on. And they arranged for this to be rotated by some kind of water-powered device. The culmination of this comes in the 11th century when an official called Su Sung sets up a house-sized device, an immense water-powered clock, which has on it certainly, yes, an armillary sphere rotating in tune with the heavens, so you can sort of look through the sighting tube and see that the right star is in the place you'd expect it to be, but also all kinds of jacks and what I can only call clockwork devices, causing you to know what hour it is, what planets are where, and so on, what stars are where, and so on. Bells ring to announce the passage of time, and so on. This has, too, something I can only, I think, call an escapement, in the sense that it has a device built into it which causes the same sequence of events to happen over and over and again, so that you can use that as a basis of counting time. In a so-called mechanical clock, it's often the swinging of a pendulum. Each swing is exactly identical to the previous swing, and so on. In Su Sung's clock, it's the flow of water from a constant head tank, so the pressure is always the same, into a special weighing device which trips when a certain amount of water has gone in. So the wheel then goes round one clonk each time it's done that. I think if we don't call that an escapement, we really are being perhaps a little uncharitable to Su Sung. So I give that as the culminating example, but it is certainly not the case, despite the fact that the Chinese court is very interested, essentially interested in having a good measure of time so it can do its jobs at the right moment, and ordinary Chinese people are too. It never actually comes to be the case that every Chinese town thinks it must have a public clock. There is a public annunciation of time in every large Chinese town from the drum tower. It's still there in Peking at the moment, where drums and bells tell you, when the hours of the day are passing. But the idea of having this wonderful exhibition of mechanical skill, and we must have one too, because they've got one in Nuremberg, so we must have one here in Freiburg, they don't go in for that. This makes me think that the story of the mechanical clock may not, at first at least, be so much about the desire for public time, because the Chinese have got publicly available time too, but something to do with the display of the particular skills involved in making clocks. So I think we might have to look at why in Europe making clever little mechanical devices that do public tricks that have some utility here is so much something that people admire.
I think that's connected with the importance of automata, one of my favourite themes in the whole history of industrialisation. Surely you're absolutely right, Chris, that there are many cultures, China is the salient example, where performing rituals at the right moment of the day and night and so on are absolutely crucial for success. And throughout all cultures which have worked with the originally Hellenistic resources of astrology, which includes a lot of Islam, this is very important indeed. If you look at such a device as this, which is a Persian astrolabe, it marks on its surface the position of a large number of stars. One has a sighting line behind it to observe the height of a star or the sun.
That's
in
this
heaven.
little sight
That's
here.
That's this, which one puts on. It gives you the capacity to change the whole device depending on which city you're in, Isfahan or Baghdad, as it might be. And on the back there's a little magnetic compass to orient it north-south. Devices like this were certainly for personal use. Large numbers of people who belong to the Islamic elite would have owned these.
At what date?
From the 11th, 12th century of our era onwards, if not slightly earlier. The original of these devices comes from Byzantium, so this is interesting. This is originally a Christian Greek device taken over and improved by Islam and then taken back by the West in the 14th and 15th centuries, so that all astrolabes that we have come from these original Islamic designs. Now, what's interesting about devices like these, as in the Chinese case, is that although, as I say, lots of individuals would have owned them, and they represent extraordinarily high degrees of craftsmanship, they aren't typically used to, as it were, regulate the order of production and the order of civic life. That's not what they're for. They are mainly for astrological or predictive use, and occasionally for personal timekeeping. So I think the whole story of mechanical clockwork does indeed start to point us towards some European specifics, and we need to think what they are.
Yes, I think that that's surely the question. It's what use these things are put to.
Absolutely.
There's this wonderful passage in The Wealth of Nations by Adam Smith, where he talks about people, how much people love these little contrivances, that the more complex and ingenious they are, the more they love to collect them. And they even add more pockets to their clothes so that they can have these to take out to display. It's kind of like people showing off their latest laptop computer now. But the question is, what do they use them for? I mean, he goes on to say, well, here's this man who has all the latest watch which he's displaying. It's wonderful and a wonderful contrivance, but he shows up late for his appointment to have lunch with a friend. And this takes us also to the kind of assumption that we make that because in the West we had the early development of clocks and watches and relatively inexpensive ones that more people could have. There's these wonderful stories about 17th century tradesmen and artisans who absolutely paid incredibly strict attention to timekeeping for their religious observances. But when it came to work, no way. They'd write in their diaries that they spent the day wandering about in the fields because the sun was shining. They showed up around after they'd had their lunch the next day. The timekeeping wasn't necessarily, for work, was not necessarily associated with having the clocks. It's actually having, we have to go to other social and economic explanations for that.
Can we take up one of Joel's points about the effects of the development of all these little mechanical devices on craftsmanship and on the making of machines? In a sense, we tend to think of the Industrial Revolution as an 18th, 19th century. That is the age of machines, but already in the West, by 1400, 1500, everyone was carrying little machines around with them, just as the most common machine nowadays is the watch. We all have one machine with us. If someone says, have you a machine with you? Most people say, no, I haven't, but then they forget the watch. Well, there were all these machines around. Now, I wondered whether there's any connection between the making, the craftsmanship, and the idea of machines and gravity and the use of gravity leading on in any direction towards the Industrial Revolution, the other side of the Industrial Revolution, that is the steam engine and the making of power machines. Is there a connection there, Simon?
Well, I mean, I think there are lots of paths you can trace from the extraordinary diffusion of mechanical clockwork in medieval Europe to the early years of the Industrial Revolution. I'm a bit worried because most of these paths work really well in 2020 hindsight, and I wonder, just how consequential they are. Here are two. One is this. What if you think about medieval mechanical clockwork and the automata, the figures of citizens, of the devil, of the dance of death, all those wonderful theatres that mechanical theatres that one sees displayed in market clocks especially, and church clocks throughout late medieval Europe. What if one thinks about that not only in terms of the effect it has on how people work and don't work, when they pray and when they don't, but if one thinks about it also through the effect it has on the notion of the machine? Because clearly one of the things that's happening is that one's worked out a way of telling time that has nothing to do with heaven. And that's absolutely remarkable. That one can almost, as it were, set up a clock system which you barely have to calibrate with heaven. So that this is a profoundly terrestrial device. And for natural philosophy, cosmology, and so on, that's an extraordinarily important development. Because in traditional ways of viewing the world, certainly in the West, and certainly in Islam, there is a great division between what happens here on earth and what happens in the heavens. In the heavens, everything is orderly, and the motion of objects is in perfect circles or combinations of circles. It is the residence of God and the angels. It is driven by a substance that doesn't exist here on earth called ether. Here on earth, we're in the realm of what they would have called physics, of change, of coming into being and passing away, of growth and decay, of life and death and struggle. And the great division between, as the schoolmen would say, physics, earth, and astronomy, up there on the other side of the moon, is also a moral division, and it's a cosmological division. And what the mechanical clock does is at least to bring down from heaven, in an explicitly Promethean way, like bringing fire from heaven, the capacity to tell regular, ordered time, which up till then had been referred to the motion of the sun and the other planets.
The only flaw being that, unlike the heavens, you do have to wind up the blasted clock from time to time.
Well, you might say that that's a really big advantage, because what that might lead to, I'm sort of free associating here quite a bit, is if I, a great clockmaker of Nuremberg or Ferrara, can make a mechanical device which does things that up till then only God in heaven had done, then first of all that makes you think about the machine of the world slightly differently. And it also makes you think about God slightly differently. God becomes an artifex, that is to say, a craftsman. God is the great technician. And you start to think, certainly lots of people in northern Italy, southern Germany, and the Paris Basin, and even Oxford, not known for its progressive views on these matters, start to think that what we can learn from looking at a machine will tell us something about how the natural order is. Because what artisans make when they make machines is rather like what God did in 6 days at the start of the world. So there's a story to be told, I think with hindsight, I'm not sure how convincing it is, but it's worth it thinking about the relationship between mechanical clockwork, natural law, and the new sciences of very early modern Europe. Certainly the relation between the scholar and the craftsman plays an absolutely fundamental role in what is going to happen in Europe, and especially Western Europe, between, say, the 1480s and the 1680s, that process we now call the scientific revolution. And the machine clock and its projection into the universe, I think, plays a really important role in that. It's quite hard to spell out how that works.
One of the great disputes or debates in this area seems to be about what was the order of proceeding. Did a society really need very precise time measurements and clocks, and so it invented the mechanical clock? Or was the presence of the mechanical clock something that then generated a huge amount of obsession with precise timekeeping? Now, most people think, well, there was a lackadaisical attitude towards time, and then the clock came along and everyone became obsessed by time. But there's a rather intriguing theory that it's the other way around, that basically by the 12th century in Europe, already there was a great need for fairly precise time measurement. Now, the argument often focuses on the role of religious orders, and particularly the Benedictines. And the argument really is that very early on, when the Benedictine orders were set up in the early Middle Ages, there was strict rules about what you should do and when you should do it. You should pray at intermittent intervals right through the day and the night, every 3 or 6 hours. And this happened in the summer and in the winter and you had to get up and pray like that. And it had to be almost exactly on these times, nones and so on. Now, particularly in Northern Europe, it might not be so bad in a warmer and pleasanter climate, but the argument, the simplified argument, is that people, in order to regularly pray in this way, they had to be woken up. And they often have to wake up in the middle of winter on a cold day. What is going to wake them up? They don't have alarm clocks. So they have to have some device which is precise, which won't freeze over in the middle of the winter, and which will wake them up. So they begin early on to develop something which goes in hand with clocks, which is bells. They develop bells which have a kind of primitive escapement sometimes, and are driven sometimes by all sorts of power, not exactly by normal gravity. So they develop bells to wake them up at these periods of the day. And out of this precision and need for exactness, a general awareness in the religious system develops. And so Europe was looking for something. It was looking for something in the religious sphere, and it was looking obviously for something to coordinate its economy and its expanding trade and business. That is the theory. I don't know what people think about that. I mean, China, you've already said it, the weakness seems to be that Eastern religions, for instance, also you need to pray at certain times.
Well, most of all, of course, we can say in Islam, where you absolutely have to do your prayer at certain times of the day. And in modern Islamic societies, of course, people will all stop together and do it. I'm unaware of to what extent it was actually a religious obligation to do your daily prayers at fixed times of the day, whether you merely had to do one in the morning and one, and so on and so forth in a general way. Can anybody give us more precise data on that, perhaps?
I think there's a call. They make
Yes.
a call from the mosque.
Yes.
They make
So if you're in a town, you'll be told.
A quite audible
That's right,
sound,
yes.
because I did, my house wasn't very far
Right.
from a mosque in Haifa, and you could hear them when they were
Yes.
calling them to prayer.
So in a town, you're going to be told in the same way that the bell will
Yes.
sound for the Angelus at the end of the day, and everyone will say the Hail Mary in a Catholic town and so on. But if you're out there in the desert, are you faced with a moral dilemma? You think, gosh, I'm not exactly quite sure whether it's time for the afternoon prayer or not.
I think perhaps the answering my own question to a certain extent, as I vaguely understand it, in the famous Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, when it starts low for morning in the world of night and so on, I think one of the times you have to pray is at sunrise.
That's defined by the sun rising.
Another is at sundown.
Yes.
And in other words, you don't have to pray in the middle of the night, and you don't have to pray every 3 hours in the middle of the night.
Oh, they're all day prayers, aren't they?
And likewise in Buddhism, although they're very strict and they're interested in regular praying, I've never encountered any Buddhist priest who leaps up in the middle of the night to pray. So you regulate it roughly. I mean, give or take half an hour, and give or take the sun going up and down.
A water clock will do well enough, probably, for the purposes of a Buddhist monastery.
That's
I
right.
think the Jewish holiday officially begins when there are 3 stars visible in the night sky, which seems obvious enough unless you're in Northern Europe, where the night sky is not visible more often than not. But most of these can be presumably coordinated through natural reference.
Actual observation of what's happening. I mean, the beginning of Ramadan is on the day when you see the first crescent.
I mean, isn't part of the clue here precisely the notion of coordination? That what's at stake in time-telling is precisely the degree to which one has within oneself, either by some elegant device or by being able to hear the call of the priest, or hear the church bell, or see the church clock, to know with confidence that one is doing what others are doing. And I think a very important aspect of medieval time culture is that it defines what it is to be a member of a community doing the same things at the same time. Now, what Joel is pointing to in the specifics of German, Italian, French mechanical clock systems is that sense of coordination rapidly turns from being a sense that one is doing the same thing as the whole community at the same time as the whole community to to the sense that one is not doing the same as anybody else, that one has now available a way of organizing one's own career through the day and night and through the week. And I see a very strong relationship, which I think emerges between, say, the 1300s and the 1500s, between mechanical clocks and eventually portable mechanical clocks, and an individualization of time, a privatization of time, so that I would say that it's more important to sort of look away from the monastic and away from the priestly and away from that kind of coordination to exactly this idea of arranging a meeting with another individual, telling other people what to do, measuring what they're doing and what we are doing. And then I think your fundamental question, Alan, you know, which comes first, this very, very intensely private individual time sense, or the satisfaction of that need by the availability of some mechanical device becomes pressing.
Yeah, I think we shouldn't exaggerate how accurate these early clocks were. I mean, by the standards of our own time, they'd be quite miserable. It isn't really until the further sophistications are added, some of them centuries later, you know, sure. Christian Huygens isn't until the 17th century with the addition of the pendulum, and that these clocks really get a kind of a modern level of accuracy. Before that, I think a 14th century clock easily could be off 20 minutes a day, and that's not what we would think is accurate, but I think it is a big step forward compared to the time measurement device that they had. Not just in terms of accuracy, but in terms of the other mechanisms that could be attached to them, because these clocks also played a very decorative role. And some of them were ones that are built in Italy by people like Dondi are quite amazing mechanisms, and I think they served as some kind of advertisement to how clever the people in this town were that they could build, and how rich they were that they could afford a clock like that.
It's very appropriate. We have the bells.
Yes, the bells ring.
Maxine.
But I mean, if we move on a bit, the accuracy, the growing sort of accuracy of these clocks is also coinciding with changing dimensions of religion during and after the Reformation in Europe. And I think we have to look at the way that time works in these kinds of societies as well. So it's not just, it's not a sort of secular sense of time we're seeing, and it is certainly a more private time, but it's an internalization of a self-discipline.
It's not too difficult to see how clocks and clockmaking and time were important in the differentiation of civilizations. What is much more mysterious, and I think has hardly been studied at all, is another technology, and this is because we don't notice it. When I'm looking out at the world like this, or reading, I read what is there, and I forget that what is there is created by glass. Likewise, when Sherlock Holmes was examining a mystery and looking through a magnifying glass, he wasn't concentrating on the magnifying glass, he was looking at the mystery. And so glass becomes almost invisible, and this is why almost no historian has ever studied the impact and the role of glass in the development of civilizations. But I've become increasingly interested in this, and I think it is one of the great keys to what we're trying to understand. The story, very simply, would be, or one version of it is, so the West, one of the reasons for the eventual triumph of Western imperialism and so on was its increasingly precise and reliable knowledge. One dramatic event in this was the development of Western science. And one key and iconic moment in this is the development of scientific instruments which allowed you to see further through the telescope, or closer through the microscope, or measure volumes, or measure pressure through different instruments, or to do chemistry and whatever. Now, if you think about all those instruments which were so crucial in the 17th century, they're all made of glass. So you have a puzzle. Could China, for example, have had the kind of Western scientific revolution without glass? if you answer no, then you have the problem of what had happened to different civilizations, that one of them had developed particularly lenses and fine glass, which allowed it to see more clearly and more precisely. It had lots of other effects, as with clockwork, as we heard earlier. It made more precise craftsmanship. Some of the most complicated instruments on Earth in the 17th century were lenses, which had to be ground. And so very precise workmanship revealed to one civilization, and as far as I can see, one civilization alone, the microcosm, what lay beneath the surface of things, and the macrocosm, what lay in the stars. Now, it is odd that most historians seem to have missed this. So we are then taken to the question of why glass seems to have faded out, as it did in Japan. By the 16th century, the Japanese had forgotten glass as a substance. When the Portuguese brought it, they said, well, they must have dug it out of the earth. We don't know what this substance is. And they called it by a Western name, gras. In China, there was a knowledge of glass, and glass technologies were fairly sophisticated in the 8th, 9th centuries, blowing of glass and everything else. By the time that the Jesuits arrived, they, native inhabitants were amazed by the glass instruments that the West had brought, and the development of of glass mirrors, of glass lenses didn't develop in China in the medieval period. Likewise, in India, there had been very fine glass. Pliny said the best glass in the world was made in India at his time, and yet by the 15th century, there's practically no glass in China. Islam is the most extraordinary story, because Islam carried on the traditions of European glass and Asiatic glass for the time after the fall of Rome. So if you'd looked at the best glass manufacturing in the world, say in about the 12th century, you would have gone to Islam. Then suddenly it dramatically collapses. The last great glass-making areas, which are in Syria, are reduced to pulp and ashes by Tamerlane, Tamerlane, and the Mongols again.
There they come again.
They came in and they took the glassmakers off to Samarkand if they wanted to go there. Otherwise, they had other means of getting rid of them, I expect. And so after 1400, roughly, almost exactly, there's hardly any glass in Islam for the next 400 years. So you have no glass in the New World, no glass in sub-Saharan Africa, no glass in Australia, hardly any glass in India, hardly any glass in China, hardly any glass in Japan before the 18th century. One civilization alone becomes obsessive about glass. It inherits the finest glass making the world has ever known from the Roman Empire, fantastic glass used in a diversity of forms, which doesn't fade out in the Middle Ages but is reduced. And then in the 12th, 13th centuries, in the great stained glass windows of the Gothic cathedrals and in the increasingly fine glass of winemaking in Italy and Murano, it develops fantastic glass. And at first this is for beauty, for protection against the weather, for the glorification of God. But after a while, somehow, in about the end of the 12th century, people begin to play with it in other ways, and in particular they begin to notice that this isn't just something that protects you or makes beautiful glasses, it's something which has a strange property in that it bends light. And so they become very interested in optics and in light, and they begin to realize that perhaps it can help you to compensate for the loss of light and sight in later periods. So it develops into spectacles. Spectacles are one of the great revolutions in the West, not developed again in any other civilization, not in Islam, not in China, Japan. Just in the West you have the development of spectacles which elongate life, have all sorts of economic consequences, but also it's out of the spectacle lenses that the development of lenses occur, and out of the lenses the microscope, the telescope, etc. So it seems to me that one of the secrets of the precision and reliability of knowledge which puts the West ahead by the 17th, 18th centuries is glass. Now, I would like to hear why I'm wrong, because I'm going to write a book about this.
Without daring to say whether you're right or wrong, I could just say that most of the glass in the West is used, is it not, for vessels most of the time. That's right, isn't it?
No. It's true of southern Europe. One of the interesting things about Europe is it's split. The glass in the southern half, which is the warm area where they drink wine, is for vessels.
Oh, but it's windows in the north to keep the weather out.
That's right.
I see. Well, I was going
And
to
wine in the south, just what you'd expect.
yes, but I know where I'd prefer to live. But I was going to say that so far as, at least it will only now apply to a comparison between southern Europe and East Asia, but that'll do. The thing is that in East Asia, if they want beautiful drinking vessels, they've already got lovely porcelain to make it out of. And perhaps glass, therefore, that might be a competitor, doesn't have an obvious niche. The niche for the fine vessel is not there. It's already well occupied by highly developed fine porcelain technology. But as for windows, of course, that is a different matter. I must admit, the window in East Asia is essentially not something you can look out of through a transparent weatherproof screen, but essentially oiled paper, which will let light in and keep the weather out, but certainly won't allow you to actually get a view through it.
Yes, and indeed, to carry that on, the early Murano glass, it was taking techniques that had acquired from the Islamic glassmakers through the Levant trade, and a number of these craftsmen had certainly come into the Murano glass workshops. In addition, some of the early vessels that were made were in white glass to imitate porcelain, because it was really the porcelain that that was wanted, and also it was the crystal glass that was made to imitate rock crystal, precious materials. So I think that it is one of those wonderful substances which you can do magical things with in imitation of these other highly valued precious object things.
Yes.
I'd like to make just one more point, perhaps express my amazement more than actually persuade you of anything, and that is that it's always struck me as inexplicable why spectacles didn't appear earlier, because certainly the Romans had excellent glass blowing facilities. They could have made lenses had they wanted to, and they must have needed them, because the same physiological processes that cause presbyopia to us now must have been true for the Romans as well, and yet they were literate. Many of them read, many of them were fine craftsmen who needed to see small things, and yet they never developed eyeglasses. Now, why?
So all of them as they aged, all of them as you age, you mentioned presbyopia, are suffering from this business, that you begin to have to hold the things further and further and
problem is
further
your
away.
arms aren't long enough.
Yes, that's it, and the spectacles enable you to
But
bring it in.
there is one thing that we may point out, and that is that I don't think that's only glassmaking that goes into spectacles. One has to have some kind of underlying, I don't want to call it scientific basis, but certainly there's a certain concept you have to have of optics and certain geometrical tools that were being used by the early lens grinders that made it possible for them. And that really is, I think, once more the inheritance of the Islamic world, and people like Al-Hazen, who is the first to actually lay down something that we would recognize as sort of a first model of optical science. And it is perhaps not as surprising, or it may be a coincidence, that the first appearance of spectacle occurs less than a decade after the translation of Al-Hazen's classic book into Latin. Now, there's no evidence that whoever invented spectacles read this, so it may be a coincidence, but it's clear that one needs more than just the idea in order to produce spectacles. And yet, all the same, it seems to be something that is so obviously useful and not necessarily beyond the technical means. I mean, we understand why the Romans didn't build a steam engine. We do not understand why they did not produce eyeglasses. Nor do we know precisely why the Chinese didn't invent spectacles. It may well be that the production of glass had fallen on hard times. So they were once jolly good at it, as you point out. But after all, if they wanted eyeglasses bad enough, the Europeans were looking everywhere for something that they could sell to the Chinese. What would have stopped the European of shipping glass to China in the same ships that took China were back from China? It shouldn't have been too difficult.
Well, that's what they did, actually, later.
That's what they did. They did.
Yes.
There's a theory, isn't there, Alan, about why you might have a greater need for the development of spectacles for long sight in Europe than you might in East Asia.
There is. I'm going to come on to that theory just in a moment, because I want to get Simon's comments, and then I'll try and answer
Yeah,
all your points.
I wonder if there isn't a profound relationship between the problem of mechanical clockwork and its appearance in medieval Europe and the appearance of eyeglasses, which is the presence of light and the significance of light in different cultures. I mean, it's very interesting, as Alan points out, that you know, in Northern Europe, glass is mainly used, or often used for windows, which I think tells you something already about the relationship between light and the domestic order. Similarly, it's certainly true that the most sophisticated theories of the propagation of light in the medieval period are Islamic. But one should notice that most of those theories are theories which suppose that we see, because a ray travels from our eye to the object, and where the object stops the ray, we see a thing. Now, what impresses me often is how sophisticated and successful techniques and artifacts can be built on the basis of ideas we now think are false. There are lots of examples of that in history, and almost everybody who was working with eyeglasses until basically the early 17th century in Europe subscribed to one or another version of the idea that we see because something comes out of our eye. And I think that's very closely related to a particular notion of light, partly a theological notion of light, which is that in Western Christendom, the relationship between divinity and light is exceptionally close and exceptionally explicit, and partly a relationship between light and domestic order. That is to say, certainly in monastic regimes and certainly in urban regimes, as time systems spread, so does the importance of illumination, domestic illumination, interior illumination, and therefore possibilities of seeing and looking and needing to see and needing to look in ways which can then be satisfied, or at least call up needs for different ways of organizing what we now call eyesight. So I think there is an interesting relationship in Western Christendom between illumination, precision, the organization of time, the organization of interior space, and the way in which vision is understood and then compensated by this extraordinary transparent stuff that you can wear on a frame. Because I really want to underline the fact that certainly by the 17th century, lens making is not merely a very sophisticated technology, it is the most precise, demanding technique of any by several orders of magnitude, by I would say 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. Grinding a perfect lens is so much more difficult and so much more time consuming, and it has to be so much more precise than almost anything else any European was doing, especially if one thinks of microscopes and telescopes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all your comments. If I can sort of try and wind up and answer, or at least knit them together a little bit before we go on to one other theory. Christopher made the point about porcelain, and I think the best way to understand why only Europe really developed glass, or certainly Europe and Islam in the early period, is if you look at the main 4 functions of glass in Europe, and then you ask whether it would have been any use anywhere to to do this. If you think of drinking glasses, not only did the Chinese have wonderful porcelain, but they also had a hot drink. And for a hot drink, something like this is ideal for drinking tea, the national drink of the East. It wouldn't be at all a good idea with an old style glass to put hot tea in that. It would crack it. So to begin with, your national drink and your wonderful pottery and your high-class and low-class pottery and porcelain precluded drinking vessels of glass in Eastern Asia. So that's one need you don't have. Windows. Glass is expensive. Paper is cheaper. It's also much more flexible, and in places like Japan where you have earthquakes, it's hopeless. It would be hopeless with traditional glass to have built windows. Also, the building constructions were very light. You couldn't have held the glass. Houses were made basically of bamboo and paper, and therefore you couldn't have put glass windows in. You need stone or bricks for glass. You don't have huge religious buildings on the whole in Japan and China of the kind that you have in King's College Chapel, where you have vast expanses where cold air is going to come in and you glorify God through glass. So for various reasons, drinking vessels and window glass, there's no point. A third use, obviously, is mirrors. But on the whole, you can get along pretty well with metal mirrors, which is what all the other civilizations did, India, even Islam, and certainly China.
Isn't there just one minor point, which is that glass is very fuel intensive, and so places where fuel are expensive, which is large chunks of China, not everywhere, and where that it's simply a reflection of the cost, a relatively lower cost of fuel in Europe.
That's right. Well, when you had to choose between, as I say, paper or some other substance and glass, pottery is much cheaper than glass. It would be very expensive.
Fuel terms?
Oh yes, I think, I mean, you can put huge numbers into a
glass has to
kiln.
be heated much higher, I think.
And it has to be heated, and you have to keep the kilns alight all the time, whereas you can let the pottery kilns go out. It's much more expensive, so that is a good reason. And then you come to the fourth major use, which is for lenses. Now, this takes me on to Joel's point about why the Romans didn't develop glasses like this. They had the technology, probably. And we do know that they used magnifying devices. One emperor kept some kind of lens on his finger, and what they did on the whole was to use water. And they'd make a bubble of glass, and they'd put water in it, and they could, so they knew that you could magnify, just as the Chinese did very early on, that you could magnify. But why didn't they develop glasses? Well, the only maybe folksy explanation I've had of this is that, but it also applies to the riddle, a later riddle, which is to do with the mechanical pounding of grain. Who needs glasses as you get old if you have slaves? The people who you're reading, you have educated slaves, and as you get older, you have people, and you say, well, I'm afraid my eyesight isn't much good. I wonder if you could read me this. So that the social relationships may have something to do with it.
Well, certainly Pliny, when telling us how he wrote his natural history, tells us that he never allowed time to be wasted when books could be read to him. And he had several servants around him while he was having his bath or whatever, who'd be reading to him intensively. So for him, hearing the text read was the thing. And of course, actually, it wasn't until quite late in the West that the idea of private silent reading came in. Who was Ambrose, Bishop Ambrose of Milan? People were astonished that when he was reading a book, you could be near him, but you wouldn't know what he was reading, because he wouldn't be saying it aloud, as everybody else would be.
Yes.
Moving their lips, at least.
Well, I mean that, Christopher, in a very egocentric way by each civilization, that it is outward looking and expansive, and all the other civilizations tend to be inward looking. And one representation I think many Westerners have of China in particular, and Japan, is that one of the reasons possibly why they didn't develop in the same way as the West, whether that was good or bad, was that after a time, certainly, they closed themselves off. This happened certainly in Japan when they stopped trade on the whole with other nations in the early 17th century. They kept out Christianity. They walled themselves off for about 200 years. This had an enormous influence on Japanese civilization, as I know. but I wondered whether it could also be a characteristic of China.
Yes, I'm glad you're very conscious there, Alan, of the fact that talking about the East closing itself off from the West may be a rather Eurocentric point of view. It's a bit like the story of the headline on a British newspaper in the 1920s, before there was radar for channel crossings or tunnels or whatever, which said, "Fog blankets channel, continent isolated." The fact is that since the centre of the world economy was in the area of the Indian Ocean and East Asia for so long, the idea that it mattered remotely to China, whether or not it had intimate connections with little foggy islands in northwestern peninsulas of a rather undeveloped kind, is rather misleading. As for the isolation of China and Japan, what happened in the case of Japan, as we know, was that there was a period when they were very receptive indeed, to the extent that the fascination in Japan with their contacts with the Spanish, the Portuguese and so on, and the worry that the Japanese shogunate developed was indeed this was all going too far too fast, especially when several important feudal lords were converting to Christianity with their entire domains. Yeah. And I think at this point Japan perhaps quite correctly thought, what's going to happen to us? Are we simply going to become yet another place that's been effectively colonized by Spanish Christians? And they had rumours of what this might mean in other parts of the world. They were not stupid. So it might well be said that the decision to cut themselves off from trade with the Catholic West, and not, of course, from China. They continued to trade with China, with other East Asian countries that they'd already been trading with, was perhaps quite a clever one. As for the isolation of China, so-called, it is true that Westerners began to complain quite bitterly when, towards the end of the 18th century, they found that they were being increasingly confined in their channels of trade with China, and in the end were confined entirely to Canton. But I don't think that there should be any sense that there was a large volume of Western trade that was dying to find its way to China, but couldn't because Canton was too full. It was simply that the Chinese officials found it very convenient for a number of reasons to confine the Westerners to one controllable outlet. And I don't think that there was any immediate sense that trade would have become a lot bigger if another port had been opened at that time. Because the thing the Westerners did feel, particularly the British, was that the fact they were made to trade at a southern port in the hottest area of China meant that they had no chance at all of selling their lovely thick woolen cloth, which is about the only thing they could think of to sell. So there is that. I wouldn't say that the story of the self-isolation of East Asia is quite so significant as it is often cracked up to be by Westerners who assume that the most beneficial thing for any nation is to have the closest possible contacts with the West and to become like the West as soon as it possibly can.
Well, there is a cost associated, of course, by not becoming like the West if we take into account the fact that the West, A, is very aggressive, and B, much of its ingenuity is translated into weaponry.
Yes, indeed.
And the net result is that you may well be right that the Chinese felt that there was very little that they should learn from the West, but the result was that they were ignominiously defeated in the First Opium War, which must have shaken them quite badly. And that is in part because they hadn't kept up, and things like that happened to other non-Western societies as well. Even so, they, you may well be right that they were doing pretty well on their own. Thank you so much. We don't need it. But the problem is the Westerners aren't going to stay in Europe. They are spreading to other corners of the world. It's also worth pointing out that one of the things that Europeans do after they discover America is some gigantic enterprise of what you might call ecological arbitrage, in which they move plants and crops from one continent to the other. And while China may have an incredibly sophisticated society going on for it in the beginning of the 16th century, they hadn't been in America. And so when Portuguese traders come to China with crops that the Chinese had not seen, like peanuts and sweet potatoes, which they had picked up, maize too, which they had picked up in America. The Chinese sort of scratched their head and said, gee, you know, this is an interesting idea.
They adopted them.
And they adopted them.
And this is one of the explanations of the great continued population growth of China in the late imperial period. That these could open up agriculture in zones that had previously been marginal, where you couldn't grow the traditional grain crops of China. And in many parts of China, the root crop became the thing that you ate. If you go to Beijing nowadays in cold weather, there are people with oil drums with fires in them selling you baked sweet potatoes. It's become the cheap food.
It may be unfair to point out that had the Europeans not gotten to America, this may have taken a lot longer to emerge in China.
Certainly so.
Well, that sounds like very good evidence against the idea that the Middle Kingdom was isolated and wanted to be.
Yes.
No, I mean, surely...
Isolated. They just didn't want a lot of trouble with difficult foreigners at frontiers, that's true.
That's right. I mean, they did have this vast trade. I mean, the country was vast. You could have anything you possibly desired.
Huge internal trade.
Except maize.
And, yes, but there was also a large South Asian trade.
Absolutely.
And this European trade, what
It
was
was
it? But
perceived as marginal.
A blip on the horizon.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And I think we have to keep that in perspective, that South Asian trade was really vast.
Yeah, but it is for everyone on this world. By 1800, it may well be true that the trade with the Europeans is a blip on the horizon, but you ignore them at your own peril. Because they will show up one day with gunboats, as they did everywhere, and they'll try to take your land, and they'll try to force you into humiliating peace conditions, and they'll chunk large pieces of your cities away and turn them into free trading areas like the British did with Hong Kong. And so maybe they're a blip on the horizon, but boy, that blip grows quickly.